Hi, can everyone hear me? Hello. Right, hello. Can everybody hear me? Oh. Right. I'm not sure. So, I'll just carry on in the hope that you can hear me. Oh, you can hear me. Right. Okay, great. So, my name is Richard Martin, and today I'll be talking about ashes, the public and crematoria, and direct cremation. So, a quick overview of who we are. So some of you may have heard of us. We're an independent company based down in Devon. We've been doing this for about 10 years, writing on ashes, on all aspects of ashes, to be honest with you, burial practices, scattering practices, that sort of thing. And we've done some research over the years. And I said to Safe, I said, let's do a webinar, and let's see if we can share some of the joy. So it's a bit strange because I can't hear anybody's voices, so I'm not getting any feedback. So we shall continue. So the world in numbers. The number of people cremated in the UK, around about 435,000, give or take. This is a figure from a couple of years ago, and a percentage of people to be get cremated is about 75%. Now, we believed some time ago that the average length of time before someone decides what to do with ashes is about a year. Well, it's changing. About 10 years ago, this is probably true, but now a lot of people are starting to act either straight away or they're doing it within, say, 6 months, and then some of them a year, and then some of them leaving it over 3 years. Lots of reasons for this. If someone hadn't said what they wanted in their will or made it clear, sometimes it can be difficult for the family to decide on what to do. Average weight of ashes. Most of you, I'm sure, pretty much all of you are funeral directors, so you'll probably know this. There's a slight variation between men's ashes and women's ashes. Men's are slightly heavier on average, with 7.1 pounds, and women's slightly less at 4.9. This is a figure from the industry. There's about 25,000 sets of unclaimed ashes in the UK at the minute, in people's storage cupboards all over the place. And then the top three chemical components within ashes are phosphate at 47%, calcium 25%, and sulfate 11%. So a lot of people come to us and say, does it affect the environment when you scatter? And the answer is no, not in small amounts. But if you concentrate it, like if you put a rose tree on top of like ashes in a sort of pot and a roastery on top. It might, because of the sodium, which isn't a great deal, but it still impacts growth, and then the sulfate. So that's a couple of bits and pieces there. Ashes, well, you can see that the trend in ceremonies is going down. Marriage is decreasing, and so is baptism. But on the other hand, ashes and cremation is on the rise, and it's sort of the over here. You've got the trend in cremation, which is gonna probably level around the 80%, and then you've got over here the trend in people getting ashes back from the crematoria. So in the 60s and 70s, most people used the Garden of Remembrance, and it was about 10-20% people who took them away. Now it's about 80% who take them away from the crematoria to scatter or put in the garden or something like that. Okay. Right. So as advertised, we were going to talk about the crematoria survey and what it revealed to us. And now this was a paper I gave to the Institute of Cemetery and Cremation Management, ICCM, last year, and with what we've done is we've improved upon it, and we've took feedback from them and tried to find out some of the answers to what the members wanted. So, brief overview. We did the early part in 2017, the second part in 2018, to early this year. The participants were self-selected. No profile of age or gender. We presume that they're the same as what's coming to the website, so about 60% female and in the 40 to 65 age bracket. And there may have been question bias, but we tried our best to overcome that. So I don't think there was much, but you never know. It's difficult to tell from where we are standing. So our first question was, what did you think of the grounds and the building? And most people thought very befitting. You can see there it's about 60% thought, yes, very befitting, with only a small minority saying that they didn't like it at all. So that's good news. That's good news. And then, but what we didn't know from this is whether people found the grounds nice or the building. So in the second survey, we kind of stretched that out a bit to see what we could find. And what we found was the grounds, beautiful, 24%, well kept, 65%, and 11% found it unacceptable. So there's an overwhelming appreciation of the grounds, which slightly contrasted, as you'll see, to the building. So this is not surprising. We all have experiences with crematoria, and certainly some of the older ones, the grounds are immaculately maintained, but the building is often kind of in need of updating or repair or something like that. So it's not surprising that we found 32% thought it was marvelous, and then with 27% certainly thought it looked quite old or quite unappealing. Okay. So we took some of the sort of opinions, and we to see what I've just put a smattering of them here. Now, age is a factor when people like the building, but it's not black and white. Some modern facilities they liked, natural light seemed to be very much a factor in families' thoughts. They quite like stained glass. They quite like sort of open space and cleanliness. But people get cross if they're not greeted, and then one family said, "Oh, it looked like a family pub chain," which I thought was quite amusing. The older buildings, some of the comments, these are typical comments at the bottom here, very dated and shabby, a bit 60s and functional, flat roof, unappealing, building looks scruffy, a bit like an office. So it's not surprising that we're getting kind of that sort of response. Then we went on and asked about the interior. Was it interior welcoming? And yes, most people thought it was excellent, and it was nice, and it was acceptable. But not one person thought that it was unpleasant. So that's really good. And a survey of sort of as a number of people we saw at the start, it's quite good for the industry to see that they're doing a good job there. Again, there was some sort of variation between the older and the newer structures. The newer structures coming in for more praise, and the ones before the 90s, the 60s to the 80s ones coming in for a bit more criticism. Okay. Now, this is quite an interesting one. So I've got two pie charts here, and this is, I think, quite an important slide for funeral directors, because this is on the over here was the on the left hand side was, did you feel you had enough time for your ceremony? And 67% felt that they did, 5% far too short, and 10% slightly rushed. And then when we compared it only a year later, less people felt they had enough time. Now, as to why this might be, I'm not so sure. Perhaps, as you know, more people are having the whole ceremony in the crematoria, and that might not be appropriate for some groups. To be honest with you, it might be that they're too big, or it is not. The person might have needed more time. The family might have needed more time, and that hasn't necessarily been accounted for when choosing the right place for the ceremony. Now, people didn't like being rushed in and out the building. They didn't like meeting other mourners from other parties. They didn't like queuing or waiting. And they didn't like the fact that some crematoria senior mourners weren't taken into account. And one of the respondents said made to scurry, which I thought was quite an interesting term of phrase. But the problem that I thought I'd highlight here is they didn't necessarily criticize the crematoria for not scheduling properly. The people who came in for the criticism were the funeral directors, and for not telling them the length of time, or informing them properly as they thought, or not giving them other options, or hurrying them up. So it seems slightly unfair to me that people are not necessarily understanding that this is not the funeral director's fault. That it's just the way the time slots work at the crematorium. And some people said, they were aware of a time slot, but the extra time was it was prohibitively expensive. So, as I said in the actual in the first slide, 2 years compared, and people are starting to feel more rushed. Okay. The Garden of Remembrance. So people didn't want to use this really. I mean, it's interesting that the overall figure says it's about 2/5 thought that they might, with a fifth saying yes they would, and a 2/5 saying no. In our experience, it's about 20% of people who might use it. And that goes with the figures at the graph at the start of the presentation, where you're getting about 80% of people now removing the ashes. It seems to me, from the feedback we get from the customers and from the people to the website, sometimes it's people with very young children sometimes use it. They've got a real place to go and memorialize. Other people who might have lived a longer life, then they perhaps have more associations out in the big wide world. I'm not certain about that. You guys will probably have a much better idea what your thoughts are on that, but that's just one of our theories. So yeah, 20% said they would use the Garden of Remembrance, and the reasons why they didn't are too impersonal, too expensive. We've had a lot of people complain about the maintenance of the Gardens of Remembrance not being up to scratch. So not relevant to the person's life, and they didn't want to come back to the crematorium. They associated with a specific aspect, and they thought there's more appropriate places to memorialize. They were taking them home, scattering in the wilderness. This is a sort of psychological thing. People didn't want to be scattered on top of other people, or simply it's not what the deceased would have wanted. I'm not sure there's any way of taking questions as we go along. I don't know. Perhaps it flags it up for you. But if you do have any questions, I think a message pops up on my screen or something like that. So please feel free to ask anything. We'll do questions at the end, but feel free to chip in along the way if you wish. Okay, money. This is a big question. So when we first asked the survey, we asked it, did you feel that you received value for money? Because if you ask someone, if something's too expensive, yes, they always say it is, and especially when it's a large sum of money. So we thought we'd ask them, did they think the crematorium represented value for money? A lot of people obviously didn't know. A lot of people weren't paying the bill, but on the whole, people thought that they represented value for money. The second survey was we just wanted to just check that we're right. Don't ask people if it's too expensive, because guess what? They think it is. So if you ask somebody if it's too expensive, 77% thought it was too high, with around about a quarter saying it's about right. Nobody said it was too cheap. Unsurprising, right? So let's delve into that a bit more deeply. So 56 thought it was value for money, whilst 20% it was not. The view reflected that it was just another part of an expensive thing. Funerals are expensive, or people consider funerals to be expensive in comparison to other things. And they thought, well, this is just an expensive part of what we have to do. So there you go. It's interesting. The local authorities, and this came up quite a few times actually. The local authorities were considered to be fair, so that if that's the price that a local authority charged, then the public were prepared to accept that that was the fair price for it. You'll have your own thoughts on that, I'm sure. So some people also commented that the value of one crematorium compared to another, and they were saying things like time at the crematoria and ambience were all things that they were prepared to pay for. So it's interesting. And people did not like hidden costs. They did not like having to pay for things like a copy of an extra DVD for the ceremony. They didn't like having to pay for a scattering on top. There was, when people got onto this, they got quite strong feelings that they paid a high figure once, and that should include this sort of thing. The container for the ashes that they got back from the funeral director, from the crematorium, also came in for criticism. A lot of people were quite sort of not appalled, but disappointed that they'd spent whatever it was, £700-800, and it might even just have been a plastic bag sealed with inside a cardboard box, and they thought, well, that's not quite on. And some respondents didn't like being marketed to. I know that certain crematoria now are sort of teaming up and sending sort of marketing material out there. So some of the respondents felt that was inappropriate. Most didn't seem to mind, but some did. Now, on the issue of cost versus value for money, people think that crematoria have value for money and too expensive at the same time. Now, looking at the economist's point of view, it's because some of the reasons might be that there's no reference points. So people don't know. They didn't pay for a cremation 2 weeks ago, or they've not. Might only do it like twice in their life. The bill's not separated. They don't see like, oh, you could have gone here and paid X, and you could have gone here and pay Y. So they have no reference points. So they're unlikely to be able to gauge what is value for money. They can't compare, and they don't know what it costs to provide either. So there's no idea in someone's mind how much these services cost, and therefore what profits being made, and therefore does it are they charging a reasonable price? And I think also going back to the local authority argument, trust is a big thing. So people tend to trust local authorities, and they have to put their trust in them. So they say, okay, this is all good. I have to pay what I have to pay. This last point, I don't know if any of you have read the Dignity report. It's well worth a read, actually. And what they've done in that is compare time to money, and they say that people expect they're not too worried about the exact figure, but they want something that represents gives them enough time to say goodbye, and they're happy to pay for that, and therefore there's a correlation between time and value, and it is reinforced in the Dignity report. And it's, so as I say, I would go and have a look at that if you haven't seen it, because it's quite fascinating. Okay. So apart from the nature of the visit, what would have made it a better experience? And the word that came through from nearly all the respondents was nothing. It's fine. It's absolutely great. They were impressed with the funeral directors. They were impressed with the people who run the crematoria. They were impressed with generally most things. There were some, when we said, well, where could the improvement be? These are the ones that came up most prevalent. So parking and space. This is not surprising to me. As we said earlier, there seems to be a general trend towards using the crematoria for the whole service. So parking, it might not have been designed for that. It might have been designed just as a relatively small chapel, and therefore you're not got parking for some large funerals that you could have catered with elsewhere. Space is an issue. Again, it relates back to that. And there was some commentary from a large number of respondents that there was no guidance of what to do or what to expect next. So people should try and crematoria should try and provide that service for people. And there wasn't that much. There for that. I'm very sorry. There's something coming through with my earphone at the minute, so I do apologise for a slight distraction there. I think I've sorted that now. Some people wanted refreshments, but not everybody. And I know some crematoria now are starting to consider that they should be a place for wakes. I don't know. That's just perhaps a trend that's moving in business somewhere. The officiant. A lot of complaints were around the officiant not preparing, seeming rushed. They seem to wanted to dash through the service, and without telling tales out of school, I think the celebrants came in for a better ride than many people from the church, who got into a certain amount of criticism. They didn't like noise or laughter behind the screens, and some commented on black smoke coming from the chimney when they were leaving. I think that was only kind of one or two there. Okay, moving on. Now, this is I think that funeral directors need to be aware of. Personally, we asked them to prioritise what's the most important thing about a cremation on the crematoria, and these are the priorities that we gave them. This is not in order: the appearance of the grounds and the building, the decor, the cost, the location, the car parking, information about services and facilities, PA system, the time allowed, and someone to meet and greet. So we asked people to prioritize this 1 to 10. Now this is the answers on a slide, and I'll explain it because it's quite fascinating. So what I expected there to be a clear distinction between what people thought was the most important and the least important. I thought perhaps cost would be, let's say, the most important, or location, but it is, but it's not hugely differential between the other things. So if you can see in this that most of these things are between like 4.5 and 6.5. So what's important for some families, clearly not for others. People very much thought that space away from mourners was important, but that it's only slightly more important than cost. It's quite a fascinating result, and I think the takeaway from this for FDs, to be honest with you, and that's like, can you offer the families some choice around the crematorium if you can gauge from the from the family what they should what their preferences are, what they want? Can you then, if you've got you might be unfortunate that you've only got one choice of crematorium, but if you're perhaps in some of the larger conurbations, you can perhaps guide people and say, well, if a PA system, they're very much into their music, or there's going to be a large gathering, then and so I think there is a sort of a takeaway that from that you will know what your strengths and weaknesses of your local crematoria are, and it's a dialogue with the family and a dialogue with the crems as to what they can offer. Another thought on this was the fact that I've seen starting to see a rise in off-site funerals. So we all know that the church is not necessarily the destination of many funerals these days. Only a few are held there, and we often see that the crematoriums are too stacked up. So I've seen an increasing trend in people using hotels to hold the whole service, and even starting to do the committal at the hearse kind of thing. I'm not saying I'm very knowledgeable in this, but it's a trend I'm starting to see, and people are using the sort of the hotel or the location as a sort of like the service, and they're staying for the reception, and it seems to be then there's no time constraints there. So it's quite an interesting thing that I've seen coming through. So yeah, priorities: distance, time, and privacy, and cost is fourth. So they're kind of seem to be the major family priorities. Okay, so that's the survey we've done on the crematoria. Now, those of you, we do an e-zine once a month, and I just thought I'd put this in there because one of the e-zines we did a couple of months ago touched on the subject of direct cremation, and I've never known such a response to a survey that we've put out through the e-zine, to be honest with you. We asked a few questions, but it sort of seemed to light a fuse within the industry. This is something that seems to be a subject on everybody's lips. So one of the questions we only asked a few questions, a very simple type thing, and we asked funeral directors whether they thought it was a threat or an opportunity, or neither. And if we ignore the neither for there, we can see that it's like almost 5, 6, 7 to 1 people, businesses thought that it was an opportunity and not something that they considered to be a threat to their business. So just a part of the choice, I think, was one of the key messages we got back from the funeral directors there. It's all part of the choice. We then asked, what percentage of funerals do you think, what proportion of funerals are going to be direct cremation in the future? And interestingly enough, there seems to be, sort of around 20 to 30. This graph includes input from celebrants, ministers, and other people involved in the cremation business. If you took out the figures for people, non-funeral directors, the figure tended to be more in the 10 to 20 bracket, to be honest with you. So it's fascinating to see that the funeral directors have a different kind of a view on this than perhaps others within the industry. But one of the takeaway points is there was very few that thought this was going to disappear overnight, or it's going to be a passing fad. Most of you thought this is going to be a principal part of the business for going into the future. Bad practice. So we get a lot of moans about people, direct cremation, people setting up, not having any premises, leaving the body, let's say, at the hospital, and this seems to quite rightly get on a lot of funeral directors' nerves. I think they think it's unfair competition. There's no correct regulation, and so we asked the question: should additional scrutiny be necessary to prevent more practice in this area? And 3/4 of people did, and only 9% of people thought that it's fine the way it is. So it's quite an overwhelming groundswell of opinion that direct cremation that perhaps could be abused by those not necessarily adhering to good practice. So I'll keep you posted on that, whatever we find next. Yeah. Okay. So there's my two. Presentations. I thought you would like to know the answers from. So I thought I'd finish this little webinar. I've got 3 more slides for you, that just to pique your interest. Because I thought you might find them amusing. So this is ashes practice around the world. So I don't know if you. I wonder if I can use a pointer. Okay, so this one over here, this is the Neptune Society. This is an underwater world that's created off Florida for people to scatter their ashes. This one down here is a practice in India where people roll around in cold cremation pyres in the hope that the bad spirits will attach themselves to the bones of the deceased rather than them. Down here we have cremation beads from Korea. I don't know how they're made. I've looked into it and I just can't work out. I think it's a crystallization and a solidification or whatever type of process of superheating the ashes. But yeah, these are from Korea. And then finally at the top here we have ash practice in Japan, where the whole family removes the ashes, the bones of the deceased, and places them in the urn. So you can see the whole family gets involved. You can see, bless them, the kids don't look wholly impressed, and you will see that it goes from the bottom upwards. So the feet need to go in the urn first. Okay. So that's that one. That's some ashes practice around the world. Then this is a slide showing different places that have got real problems with ashes. So here we've got Jane Austen's house up here. I don't know if you can all see the pointer. I think you probably can. This is Ben Nevis. This is Tarn House in the Lake District, and this is the haunted house in Disneyland. And all 4 of them have had to do press releases on telling people, please don't put ashes there. Jane Austen's house, people were sneaking out for the wall and putting the rose bed in the garden, would come back, and sometimes there might have even been 3 or 4 piles left over the weekend. Ben Nevis, the issue they have here, it's a very, very sensitive ecosystem, and but also combined with a very very important place in sort of Scottish society mentality. And so a lot of people will say, put my ashes at the top of Ben Nevis, but there were so many that the phosphate and the sulfate were damaging the lichens and the ecosystem. Tarn House is another one, a very, very popular place for people to scatter, but with people have not considered uses by others. So there was conflict with people wishing to have a ceremony and then also not doing it properly, just upending an urn, leaving a pile of ashes there and making a right mess. And others felt that it wasn't necessarily a desirable picnic spot anymore. So there was a conflict there. So the National Trust sort of flagged that up. And then finally, we have the haunted house in Disneyland in America. And this got into the news because there's so many people that choose to scatter their ashes at the haunted house that they have a code and a special cleanup team as well, so that as soon as it happens, they sort of shut the ride down and people come along with a specialist, I suppose, vacuum cleaner. I'm not so sure really, but yeah, it's causing them an issue, and they've broadcast and said, please don't do it. It's causing other guests problems. And finally, the final slide is about what gets in the news with ashes. And I thought this might amuse you as well. So we have a lot of thefts of ashes accidentally. People steal them, they take the urn and they didn't realize what they're taking. We have them appear in charity shops, in house clearances. And this is occurring, interestingly, more and more. As more ashes are brought home, more people are doing house clearances, they don't necessarily realize that there's an urn in the cupboard. And as you know, I'm sure that ashes usually end up in a wardrobe upstairs or something like that in the bedroom, and people say, "Oh, we need to get a house clearance in," and they end up in charity shops. Veterans in the US, very, 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 very strong culture in the US around their ex-military, and they get very cross if there's not enough money for a funeral or someone's disrespected. The ashes are not provided for them, so there's plenty of appeals for interring them correctly. And the final one at the bottom is disputes, and we get a lot of this, people calling up one family wanting the ashes and another family member sort of not allowing it, and we see it with a lot with sort of step families, where the sort of the wife has got them, and the kids kind of the first marriage kind of wants them. So we get a lot of that, to be honest, and I'm sure you do too. I know that. I know that there's safe produce some guidelines on who you're supposed to hand the ashes to, and who's entitled to them, that sort of thing. So that's me. It was well within the hour because an hour's a long time. So if you've got any questions, I'm not sure how you post them, but I think if you've got any questions, then let's let's have a look. So if there's no questions, then that's fine. But you can always give us a call or an email, Richard at scattering-ashes.co.uk, or if you haven't got our details, we're pretty easy to find on the internet. So you can always give us a call if you've got any questions or you need anything. That's no problem at all. Okay. It's quite strange. You get unless I don't get to hear anybody. I don't know if you've got any questions at all. Okay. Oh, okay, guys. Well, I hope that was of interest. As I say, you don't get any feedback, so I hope that was of interest. And thanks for tuning in, as they say, and thanks for letting me give the talk. Okay.